Among the Hidden by Margaret Peterson Haddix, Chapter 19. Luke left Jen's that day with a pile of books and computer printouts clutched to his chest. "Some reading material for you," she'd said, "so you'll understand." Back in his own room, Luke sat down on his bed and opened the first book. It was thick and carried its title in ominous black letters, "The Population Disaster." The type inside was small and closely spaced. Luke read a sentence at random. "While debate continues over the carrying capacity of the Earth," he skipped ahead. "If the total fertility rate in industrialized countries had remained at or below 2.1, Luke saw that reading this book would be like puzzling out the letters Dad got from the government. He glanced at the other two books, The Famine Years Revisited and The Population Reversal. They looked no easier. The computer printouts were at least brief, but both The Problem with the Shadows and The Population Law, Our Country's Biggest Mistake, were full of big words. Luke sighed. He was tempted to put the books aside and just ask Jen to explain them to him, and he might have, except for what she'd said as she begun handing them to him. "Oh my gosh, I don't think you can read, can't you?" "Of course," Luke had answered stiffly. "I was reading in the chat room, wasn't I?" "Yes, but you could have been—" "Oh, never mind. I've offended you again, haven't I? Me and my big mouth. It wouldn't have been anything to be ashamed of, even if you couldn't. Oh, I'm making things worse. I'll shut up. Here." And it had seemed to Luke that she'd pulled even bigger books off the bookshelf after that. Now he resolutely turned to the beginning of the population disaster and began reading. "Since some elements of the overpopulation crisis were foreseen in the 1800s, an uninformed observer could only wonder why humankind came so near total annihilation. But—" Luke reached for the dictionary and settled in for the long haul. It rained for the next several days, so Luke read constantly, not even tempted to race over to Jen's instead. He could hear Dad banging around downstairs, stomping in and out from the barn or the machine shed. Now that the harvest was in, Luke thought Dad might be bored without the pigs to take care of. So Luke read cautiously, always ready to shove his population book under his pillow and replace it with one of his adventure books. The preparation paid off on the fourth day, when he heard Dad's footsteps on the stairs. "Hey, Luke, what are you up to?" "Nothing," Luke said, turning Treasure Island right side up at the very last minute. Dad didn't notice. "Want to play cards?" They played rummy on Luke's bed. Luke could feel the corner of The Population Disaster poking his back throughout the entire game. And he kept wanting to ask Dad about what he was learning. He spent most of the first game biting his tongue. Dad won. "Again?" Dad asked, shuffling the cards. "If you don't have any work you've got to do." "In November? With no livestock? Only work I've got to do now is figuring out how we're going to pay our bills once the hog money runs out." "Isn't there some way to grow stuff inside during the winter? Like down in the basement with special lights, lots of water and extra minerals? And then you could sell it?" Luke asked without thinking. He'd just finished reading a chapter in the population book about hydroponics. Dad squinted. "Seems I did hear tell of that once." Luke won the next hand. Dad didn't seem to be concentrating. At the end, Dad said, "Mind if we quit now?" Luke was terrified Dad would ask where he'd heard of hydroponics, so he just said, "No problem." Dad left muttering, "Growing food inside. Luke wished he'd had the nerve to ask about the population law, or the famines, or even some family history. Once he got past the dense language, the books Jen had loaned him were full of revelations. As best he could understand it, the world had simply gotten too full of people about 20 years earlier. Poor countries had it particularly bad, and people there often starved or were malnourished. But then something worse happened. Terrible drought struck parts of the world that always grew the most food. For 3 years they grew almost nothing. People everywhere starved. In Luke's country, the government began rationing food, only allowing people to have 1,500 calories a day. And to make sure there was food, they seized control of all food production. They forced factories that had made junk food to crank out healthy food instead. They forced farmers to move to land that would be more likely to produce. "Is that why we don't live near our grandparents?" Luke wanted to ask his parents. But the government didn't think that was enough. They wanted to make sure there would never again be more people than farmers could feed, so they passed the population law too. In the evenings, spooning in his stew or cutting up his meat, Luke felt pangs of guilt now. Perhaps someone was starving someplace because of him. But the food wasn't there, wherever the starving people were. It was here, on his plate. He ate it all. "Luke, you've been so quiet lately. Is everything all right?" Mother asked one night when he waved away second helpings of cabbage. "I'm fine," he said, and went back to eating silently. But he was worrying that maybe the government was right, and that he shouldn't exist. Only when he got to the 2 computer printouts did he begin to feel better. One of the articles began, "The population law is evil." The other said, "Hundreds of children are hidden, mistreated, starved, neglected, abused, even murdered for no reason. Forcing children into the shadows can be counted as genocide." "How can this be?" he asked Jen a week later, when he finally got a chance to go back to her house. "How can the books and the articles be so different?" She handed him a glass of soda. "What do you mean?" she asked. Luke pointed to the population disaster. "This book says the human race would have gone extinct if we hadn't had the population law. And this," he held up and shook the Problem of the Shadows article, "this says the population law was totally unnecessary and cruel. It says there was plenty of food, even during the famines, except that the barons were hoarding it." Belatedly he remembered that Jen was a baron. "Sorry." Jen shrugged, not the least bit offended. "So, what's the truth?" Luke asked. Jen shook potato chips into a bowl. "Well, think about it. The government allowed those books to be published. They probably even paid for them. So, of course they're going to say what the government wants people to believe. They're just propaganda, lies. But the articles, the authors of those probably put themselves at risk getting the information out. So they're right." Luke pondered that. "Then why'd you make me read the books?" he asked. "So you'd understand how stupid the government is," Jen said. "So you'd understand why we have to make them see the truth." Luke looked at the stack of thick books on the Talbots' kitchen counter. They looked so official, so important. Who was he to say they weren't true? Chapter 20. Luke feared he'd have to wait months between visits to Jen once the snow started. But the weather proved kind that winter. Most days were dry and clear. He didn't have leafy trees to hide behind, but he began to feel safe anyway, crawling through his and Jen's backyards. By mid-January, he could make the entire journey without his heart beating abnormally at all. The odds against someone watching from one of the other barren houses seemed too astronomical to worry about. His only concern was Dad. Dad usually hung around the house a lot during the winter. Without the hogs to tend to, he could easily have been there even more than usual, preventing Luke from ever sneaking out. But suddenly Dad had taken to heading to town many mornings, yelling up to Luke, "I'm going to the library. You got something up there to eat for lunch, don't you?" Or, "There's some plastic tubing over to Slyton I want to check out. Tell the boys when they get in from school, you hear?" "It's that hydroponics notion," Luke bragged to Jen one day in late January while they were sitting at the computer together. "I got Dad all excited about it, and now he's too busy with that to notice what I do." "What's hydroponics?" Jen asked. "It was in one of your books. You know, growing plants indoors without soil, just using water and special minerals." "Oh," Jen said. "Does he think the government would actually let him do that?" "I guess so," Luke said. "Why wouldn't they?" Jen shrugged. "Why does the government do anything?" Luke didn't have an answer to that. Jen turned back to the computer chat room, where everyone was debating fake IDs. "Carlos, Mom says they won't buy me one until I'm 18, because she thinks the government wouldn't challenge an adult as much, and maybe they'll be cheaper then." "Pat, maybe Sean and I will get ours by the time we're 90. Dad and Mom have been saving for them for as long as I can remember." "Yolanda, my dad says he's waiting to find the one that's foolproof. He says there are too many bad ones out there." Jen began typing furiously. "Who needs a fake ID? Carlos, they'd probably get one for you that says John Smith, and you'd have to spend the rest of your life trying to pass for an Anglo. My parents have been begging me to get a fake ID for years, but I won't until I can have one that says Jen Talbot and is really mine." Have you all forgotten about the rally? We're all going to get real IDs that say who we really are. We aren't fakes. We shouldn't have to hide. She jabbed the enter button so hard the computer shook. But Jen, Luke said timidly, I thought you used a fake ID to go shopping with your mom. It said you were her niece. Jen turned her fierce gaze to Luke. No, that was just a shopping pass, she said. I don't like using that either, but I figured I can't fight my parents about everything. What they're talking about, she pointed at the computer screen, is taking on a false identity permanently. Most shadow kids do that eventually. They go live with another family and pretend to be someone they aren't for the rest of their lives. So you'd rather hide? Luke asked. He thought about using a different name, living in a different family, being a different person. He couldn't imagine it. No, of course I wouldn't rather hide, Jen said irritably. But getting one of those IDs, there's just a different way of hiding. I want to be me and go about like anybody else. There's no compromise, which is why I've got to convince these idiots at the rallies that our only chance. There was a shocked blankness on the computer screen after Jen's entry. Then Carlos ventured, Jen, got any of your parents' blood pressure medicine handy? Sounds like you need it. Jen stabbed the power button on the computer. The screen instantly went dark. She spun around in her chair and clenched her fist. Arg! She screamed with a grimace of frustration. Jen? Luke asked. He leaned away from her in case she decided to use those clenched fists. Jen turned to Luke in surprise, as though she'd forgotten he was there. Don't you ever feel like saying, I can't take this anymore? She asked. She leaped up and began pacing the floor. Don't you ever just want to walk out into the sunshine and say, forget hiding, I don't care. Am I the only one who feels this way? No, Luke whispered. She whirled around and pointed at the computer. Then what's wrong with them? Why don't they understand? Why aren't they taking this seriously? Luke bit his lip. I think, he said, people just have different ways of expressing what they feel. Those kids make jokes and complain. You run around screaming your head off and tackling people. He was proud of himself for figuring that out, considering he really only knew 5 people in the whole world. But for the first time, he wondered how the rest of his family would cope if any of them had to hide. Dad would get grumpy. Mother would try to make the best of it, but you'd be able to tell she was really unhappy. Matthew would be quiet, but look sad all the time, the way he looked every time anyone mentioned the pigs they couldn't keep anymore. Mark would gripe so much he'd make everyone miserable. For the first time, Luke felt a glimmer of pride, that he dealt with hiding better than anyone else in his family would, he thought. Jen snorted at his explanation. Whatever, she said. She slid back into her chair by the computer. But the rally's in April. I've got 3 months to make sure everyone's ready. She switched on the computer and began typing furiously again. Luke slipped away a few hours later. He wasn't even sure Jen noticed him leaving.